Today we conclude our section on groups, group processes, by delving still further into the influence that the group can have over us, the individuals, our performance, our behavior, our attitudes. Along the way, we're going to look at some processes called social facilitation and social loafing, go still further into this thing that we call conformity. Why do we yield? When do we yield? And what about teams? Can we gather anything from all this study of groups to say something about how to staff a team, how to put together a high-performance team, how to use what we know about groups so that we can somehow enhance team performance without pushing it so far that we wind up with blind obedience? Some of the things we'll consider today. But first, let's start with a model of group processes. The notion here is that actual group performance results from whatever the potential performance of the group is, and potential is one of those hypotheticals. Like intelligence, we'll never know really what the top limit of potential performance is. But it's some combination of what the abilities are that individuals bring to the group, plus their individual motivation, and some group processes that add to it as well. The processes result in process gains. That's a plus. Anything that happens in the group that ups its performance over what you would get out of just adding up individuals' performances. And then you have to subtract out process losses. And from that, we get this thing called actual group performance. So what could be a process gain in a group? How do you add to a group over and above what you have? Some new way to motivate the workers. That would be a gain over what existed before. Adding in some new technology for the group, whatever it is. Handheld computers, new communication systems, something like that would enhance performance. Any information systems that are added in that somehow improve coordination of information and communication, so that information is getting to people in a more timely way and getting to the people who need it in order to do their jobs. And some system has been introduced that improves communication as well. Maybe an email system, maybe video conferencing, some kind of technology that improves communication. Any addition of information that comes to the group, however it comes, new resource available, any new ideas that are tossed out into the group that are useful. Somebody's able to somehow give the group direction before it had been wandering, and somebody says, let's pull up our socks and get this done. Or somebody starts to give some opinions. This is going to work, this isn't going to work. All of that would add up for some kind of process gain. And finally, one of the things that we'll be spending time on in a couple of weeks, improved leadership. One of my favorite topics is the impact of the bad boss on the organization. I must be influenced by too much Dilbert. So all of these are things that would improve what's going on in the group. Process gains. But that's not all that happens in the group. I should add one more thing onto process gains as well, and that's anybody who can come into the group and raise the morale of the group somehow. Bring a sense of cohesiveness. So what are process losses? What is it that somehow affects the group in a way, so now it's not performing nearly as well as it had performed in the past? One of the things that you always have problems with when you get a group of people together is coordinating them. How are we going to get the work that A does to B and the work that B does to C, because B can't do the work until A does it, et cetera, et cetera. Or we all have to find a time to get together, coordination that way, and work on it simultaneously. People have to be prepared when they come into situations in order to get the job done. And so you're relying on people to come in prepared to the situation. If somebody's not, there's another type of coordination problem there. You have to wait while somebody catches up in terms of work. Person's physically there but not prepared. Coordination problem. This becomes a process loss. And invariably those kinds of things happen in groups. Communication problems. The age-old, we have a failure to communicate. Houston, we have a problem. Getting the information in a timely way to the individual who needs it, and in such a way that the individual can understand it and it's useful. There are two things that are involved in communication problems: timeliness of it and the clarity of the message. How often do you receive things in the mail and the deadline's already passed? Useless. Why bother? Okay, not getting it in a timely way. You need some information and you can't. You have some project that's due and you know it's not going to come in terms of the quality that it should because you're relying on somebody somewhere to get information to you, and that information isn't going to come in a timely way, and somehow you have to patch together and cover for the fact that the information is not there. That's a process loss every time that happens. Or somebody sends you something and it's gibberish. It's gibberish for two reasons. It's an electronic communication, and the gremlins that are in the computer have done something really strange to it. And what you get out is something that's not a message at all, but there are a few words and the rest of it looks like a needlepoint pattern. That can happen. So some kind of electronic glitch in communication. Or somebody sends you something and it's meaningless. I mean, you say, like, what is this? It doesn't make any sense at all. I can't use this. Communication problem. Communication problem, process loss. The job can't be as good as it would have been if you'd gotten the information in a timely way and you've gotten it in some way that was useful to you. This is the big role of people who are in information systems, putting out reports that people can use. Motivation problems, morale problems, detract from group performance. When the group is experiencing low morale, when the group is experiencing a sense of alienation, a lack of commitment, the effort just isn't going to come in. It's a sense of, why should I bother? Nobody else is bothering. It's not fair. We can go back to notions of equity, if you will, and that plays a role in all of this. If you could somehow, people have the ability, they have the skills, they have the experience, they have the information, but they're not willing. And there are groups that function like that. And so the effort level just doesn't come forth. Process loss. A lack of information, a lack of ideas, a lack of direction, a lack of opinion, process loss. And problematic leadership. How often this makes a group dispirited. The people in the group have all the capability, and they find themselves working for somebody who has a real knack for killing morale, whatever the way. We'll have ample opportunity to go into this, as I said, in a couple of weeks. But it certainly detracts from what could happen in the group. The members of the group don't trust the leader. They feel exploited by whoever the leader is. And they withhold effort in that instance because we go back to our notions again of fairness and equity. Nobody wants to be exploited. Nobody wants to be taken advantage of. Process loss in all of this. So you wonder, I spend so much time talking about process loss, why even bother with teams or groups? And we'll see why as we come towards the end of this lecture. There's ample evidence out there that, in fact, teams put together well, trained well, can perform better than a group of individuals doing the same thing. One of the things that enhances performance is something called social facilitation. Let me revise what I said. Enhances performance sometimes, but not all the time. You can see here that there's two situations that occur. The natural tendency, the dominant response of most people is when in the presence of others, our drive level is aroused, we perform better. Why exactly? We're not sure. There are a couple of theories that we go into, but it's like being on camera or on TV. Okay, you know people are looking, and so you perform better. A little before class, I was talking, and we were talking about experiences people might have had where they actually observe themselves performing better in the presence of others. Kelly, what were we talking about? You want to clue others in?
I know sometimes, especially in the summer, I do a lot of running, and I usually, run with a friend. And when I'm by myself, I'm reluctant to keep myself motivated to go the extra mile, to just stay with my program. But when I'm with someone, I find myself, wanting to look good for that person, wanting to know that I'm not, I'm not a person that gives
Yeah, whether there's some underlying
them
competition maybe that goes on. It's hard to say what it is. Exactly my experience too. I haven't done as much jogging, running as I used to, but there was a time when I was with a group, and when you're with the group, that group keeps your pace up, that's for sure. You keep pace with who's ever running in the group, and I don't know whether each person starts running a little bit faster or whatever happens, but I always found that my time was much better with a group than it was alone, for one thing. And the other thing, regularity of running. You know you have to meet the group at that time, and you get out there and you do it. If you're by yourself, well, I could put it off, and nobody will know the difference. So there's something about that public aspect of performance that has a tendency to enhance it. You do better, and we'll talk about some of the reasons. But sometimes that's not the case. Sometimes the presence of other people can distract us, and we don't do as well. Imagine, anybody here ever play piano? Any musical instrument? The situation I want to put forth, even if you've never played a musical instrument, you may know about, where you practiced, your recital was coming up, and you practiced, and you practiced, and you really had that piece memorized. And you got out on stage in front of everybody else, and whoops, stage fright, you couldn't remember a thing. You froze in front of a crowd. And so that's the other side. Sometimes the group is distracting. We get caught up on other things, or we get apprehensive in front of people. And so one of the explanations in all of this, if we try to take a look at it, is if we know the task really well, running you know really well, you've done it a lot of times, there's not much that you could get distracted on in running. It's one foot in front of the other. If it's something that you've done lots of times and you're very familiar with, in front of a group, you're going to perform better. In front of others, in the presence of others, your performance goes up. But for something that's new, that's extremely difficult and requires your concentration, thinking that somebody else is looking on and observing you at this point becomes distracting. Gets in the way of your concentration, gets in the way of your attention. And so in that case, the presence of others doesn't help. We'll make some suggestions whenever we're engaged in training and trying to teach people new things. Early stages keep people working individually. Later stages bring them together and put them in a group. One of the things we learn. Another aspect about social facilitation is something that we call evaluation apprehension. The explanation here is that the reason we perform the way we do is we are so concerned with what other people think of us, that in the presence of other people, we carry around with us this implicit notion that people are making judgments of us. Natural inclination, we want people to think well of us. We want people to think well of us. We perform as best we can. Evaluation apprehension. There are a lot of things that you would not engage in public because you want people to think well of you. In public, we adhere to good manners. In public, we adhere to all of the social conventions because we want people to think well of us. Think for a minute how you might eat if you're all alone, and how you might eat when you're in the presence of family, and how you might eat when you're at a restaurant. The presence of others who are familiar still increases a little bit the way you conform to good table manners, and of course the presence of others who you don't know in a restaurant raises that even more. When you're by yourself, you might not even bother with any kind of silverware. Right out of the carton, use your hands. I'm sure everybody's experienced that at some time or another. Doesn't matter how you eat when you're all by yourself. Standing up, sitting down, lying down. Okay? The difference that we have in the way we behave in the presence of others. So that's social facilitation. We said sometimes it increases performance when the task is really well known. Sometimes it distracts from performance if the task is not familiar or if it's very difficult. But groups have yet another impact on us. And that is, sometimes we engage in something called social loafing. It's the tendency of individuals to exert less effort when they're working in groups. It's particularly the case when we have what are called additive tasks. That is, people are all doing the same task to make it go faster. Like a group of people stuffing envelopes. Everybody's engaged in the same thing. Everybody's stuffing the envelope. In this case, the larger the group we find, really, the more the effort drops over individuals. So, for example, 6 people stuffing envelopes is not 6 times faster than one person stuffing an envelope. Yes, the task gets done faster. But now we have some kind of loss in all of this. And the loss is due to some lack of effort, motivation in the individuals who are doing it. You can get lost in a group. The bigger the group gets, the easier it is to get lost in the group and figure somebody else will cover for me. You've all at times had to engage in group projects here. Have you ever had some experience in doing it where you thought, not everybody's contributing equally to this group? Gerard, we had chatted a bit about this.
Yeah, like you said, using an example of a group or a joint project, personally, I found that usually one person or maybe 2 people in the group usually don't work to their fullest potential. Therefore, they rely on the remaining members of the group to accomplish the task. By not, because they're doing the most of the work.
Right. All right. And you know that your friends will often carry you. Your friends may be reluctant to say, hey, pull up your socks and get working, which is really the way a team should operate if you're going to bring the full pressure to bear on individuals. But sometimes we're generous with our friends and we try to understand what their problems are and we buy their excuses. And so the rest of the group puts in a little more effort to cover for the individual who's not putting in the effort. Hold these thoughts in mind when we talk about teamwork towards the end of the class because there's something to be said for that. So I said the larger the group, the easier it is to slough off the sense that somebody else will pick up the work. Groups of 3, it's a little difficult to slough off because there are not too many of you. As you start to go to 4 and 5 and 6 in this type of group work, it's easier for somebody in the group to not carry full weight. And unless there's pressure put on that individual, then social loafing goes on, or free riding, as it's sometimes called. Happens all the time in groups, and this is a process loss for a group if somebody's not carrying full weight. So how to counteract this in a group? It relies on high standards and high performance norms in order to get something like this done. Let me also add, before we jump to how do we build the pressure up on individuals so everybody's producing equally, how do we get them to conform, say that social loafing is more of a US phenomenon than it is a worldwide phenomenon. So that when studies were done examining social loafing in China, didn't find this at all. Much more of a group orientation there. People did not slack off when they worked in groups. They were not more productive working individually. So maybe part of it reverts to good old Yankee individualism, and we have trouble moving off that. Of course, when you work on your own, you are responsible for the outcome. Somebody knows where to point the finger. And you can't hide when you're working on your own. It was also not true when they tried this kind of research in Israel. Again, more of a group orientation there than in the US. So we have to be cautious about some of the things that we talk about in class in terms of generalizing it to a worldwide phenomenon. So we come then to this notion of conformity, yielding to the group. When we talk about yielding to the group, with conformity, there has to be some way that we can see that there's conformity. We're talking about actually changing behavior from what it would have been if you were all on your own to something that the group wants behavior to be. Oh, same thing with attitudes. Conformity, yielding to the group. You may think of yourself as a nonconformist, but by and large, almost everybody is engaged in some type of conformity, and sometimes, we talked about this before in typical norms, dress norms, the typical conventions of behavior that we adhere to. We talked about how difficult it is to violate norms previously. But now I'm talking about real instances of seeing your own behavior change to yield to the group. The situation I'm thinking of is, well, you have a movie in mind you'd like to go to this weekend. But 3 of your friends want to go to another movie. You all want to go together. You want to be with your friends. How much effort are you going to put into trying to persuade your friends to change their mind and go to the movie that you want to go to? Chances are you're going to yield. You're going to go with your friends. And so one of the reasons we engage in conformity behavior is it takes a lot of effort defending an independent position. There is the reward then to be gathered of not having to put in a lot of effort when you engage in conformity behavior and when you yield to the group. But that's not the only thing that goes on in terms of rewards. We like that group. We want the group to think well of us. And so we yield to get group approval, the social approval of the group, the reward of that, and to avoid the group disapproving of us in some way and feeling the wrath of the group and some type of disapproval. The ultimate disapproval of the group, as they put pressure on us to yield and conform, is first expressing displeasure, letting the individual know, hey, you're not measuring up to standards. That's not how we behave here. That's expressed directly. But if the individual persists, ultimately it's shunning the individual, pushing the individual out of the group. That's powerful stuff to deal with for groups that you're attracted to and attached to not have contact with the group. And so the power of the group in terms of reward power and in terms of punitive or punishment power. And in that case, the yielding may be because we want the rewards and we want to avoid the punishment. But at core, there isn't really a private acceptance of this is right. And so when we talk about yielding to get the rewards and avoid the punishments, we're talking about something called compliance. That's conformity, that's compliance. Going along with the group. You don't really believe it, but you don't want to put in the effort. And you don't want the group to be displeased with you. But there is also conformity with private acceptance, much more powerful kind of thing. Doesn't even rely on the group's power anymore. When we start to deal with notions of conformity with private acceptance. So we're going to see then that groups have, through norms, two types of power to influence us. The informational power of norms says that we're conforming because of private acceptance. We believe that what the group is doing is the right thing. In this case, we're engaging in that type of behavior, the yielding behavior, because the group knows the right thing to do. We don't. They're informing us. They're providing us with information as to what is appropriate in the situation. This is particularly true when we're in new situations. We've never been there before. You look around at the group to see what the group is doing, to find out what the appropriate behavior is. You're new in an organization. You look around. You see how people dress. You see how hard they work. You see how prompt they are in doing things. The group is providing information for you. You go to a fancy dinner party. Silver arrayed to the left, silver arrayed to the right. What's the right spoon to use? What's the right fork to use? You're not used to all of this. I don't know if anybody's ever found themselves in that kind of situation. And so you carefully look to see what people on either side of you are doing. You're a new faculty member. Your first meeting, a vote is called for. You have no idea what's the appropriate way to vote on the issue. You're without a clue. Kind of look around and see what people are doing. And see, most of the people put their hand up on one issue. That's where your hand goes up. The group is providing information for you. In this case, it's informational power of the group. Interesting thing about this informational power of the group is that there are norms that are set as to what's appropriate, and then we see these norms transmitted over generations from time to time. Intriguing research has done this. Some people leave the group, new people come into the group, and that norm stays. That's how we do things here. Doesn't change. And norms sometimes hold their power to influence way beyond when its usefulness anymore. At one time it served a purpose. Now it's tradition. But the power of tradition can be very powerful. I live across the street from a primary school, and there's a playground close by. For years, there were 2 sets of monkey bars. I guess they decided it's too dangerous. They took down those metal bars and put up all kinds of fancy plastic equipment, very colorful and very nice, and new types of climbing. But for years, 2 sets of monkey bars. Kids went out on the playground. New kids came into the school. Kids graduated from the school. But somehow, they always knew which were the boys' monkey bars and which were the girls' monkey bars. Norm transmission. Any usefulness to it? No. Tradition, transmission. The norm persisted over time. And those norms happen in organizations as well. And sometimes people forget to question, why are we doing things this way? Because that's how they've always been done. So informational power. The reward and punitive power we've already looked at. And that can be very strong on individuals. You adhere to the norms of the group for reward power for social approval and to avoid the punitive power. And finally, the other aspect of that, if we're looking at rewards and punishment, the thing that I mentioned at the very beginning of this discussion, it's not worth our effort to stand up and defend our position in many instances. So we think we're right. But maybe the issue isn't important enough to us, so we're not going to bother to put the effort in. Which leaves us with a situation that we want to examine, and that is, are there situations, I'm going to jump ahead and then come back, that influence conformity? Can we structure a situation so it's more likely for somebody to conform? And can we structure a situation so it's more likely for people to behave in independent ways? Because there are times when you want people to be independent. You don't want them in organizations to totally surrender their judgment and yield to the group. We'll talk about that more when we deal with decision making. That's not good for the group. From some perspective, people might say I don't have to deal with that troublemaker out there who's always somehow disagreeing with what the rest of the group does. But that troublemaker may be a very important person in the organization because that designated troublemaker is willing to bring forth information and ideas that are useful to the group and the group needs to consider before making a decision. So you don't want to destroy independence either. You want conformity to get effort level up. You want conformity so that people trust each other and there's easy communication and there's coordination. But you don't want so much conformity that you now have blind obedience and you suspend independent judgment. So the question is, how do you do that? And what are the conditions that make for more conformity? Now I'm going to back up and talk about really a seminal piece of research that was done in the area of social psychology by a guy named Solomon Asch. The Asch conformity task. You see this in lots of textbooks. It's a basis for a lot of what we know about situations for conformity. The research that he did is he brought students in and he told them they were going to engage in a visual perception task. What's the task? Well, we have a standard line on the right, and we have we have a standard line, okay? And we have 3 comparison lines. And the task is to pick the correct comparison line that's the same size as the standard line. Typically, it's a no-brainer. It's quite apparent which is the exact size. And if you look at this, it should be pretty apparent to you which is the right size one too. Okay? Somebody want to venture a judgment on this? I said it's a no-brainer. Kelly? Line C, sure, okay. That's what everybody else was going to say in the class too, right? It is line C, there's no doubt about it. Okay, line A is too small, line B is too big, it's line C. So he has this situation. Now I have to diagram something for you too, so you understand the setting. Students are seated around a table. So imagine rectangular table. He worked with groups of 7 to 9. Let's go with a group of 8. Okay, so you have position 1, position 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8. Seven of those people were Confederates, collaborators of Ash. The real subject in this research was seated right there. Everybody else is in on this. The first 2 times he shows slides like this and asks judgments, everybody gives the correct answer. This begins to build up some trust. Then comes the first real trial. And now he shows one of these slides. Person 1 says A. Person 2 says A. Person 3, 4, 5, and 6 all say A. It comes to 7. What does person 7 do? Does he go along with the group? They were all right the other 2 trials. What's going on here? Does he go with the group? Does he say, like, maybe something's wrong with my vision and I'm not seeing things correctly? I know it's C. Does the person stay independent? And then 8 again comes back and says A. Well, in at least 1/3 of the instances, the person yielded and went along with everybody else in the group. What do you think you would have done if you were in that hot seat? Anybody want to venture what you think you might have done sitting there? Kelly?
I wouldn't have conformed. I mean, if I really strongly thought that, the correct answer was a different answer, I would certainly.
You would have been comfortable, and you would have been in what the majority of people did. 2/3 of them did stay independent. Does anybody here think you would have questioned and gone along with the group? Remember, 1/3 of the people did. Oh, Diane, I see you nodding. You would have gone with the group. Why? No?
Everybody together,
Everybody,
Yeah,
yeah.
must be right.
Either they're right, or why did people conform? When it seemed quite apparent, on the face of it, that wasn't the right answer. And we could spin out a lot of reasons. One is, again, you go along with the group. You don't have to risk having the spotlight turned on you and wonder, maybe I was wrong. I mean, if you're wrong, there's still safety. Everybody else was wrong, so it doesn't matter. Or maybe people thought they misunderstood. You get to that point and you hear everybody else giving another answer and you begin to have some doubts about yourself. Did I hear the instructions correctly? Maybe I misunderstood the directions. And so you go along with the group. You begin to think of reasons for why you should go along with the group. Or maybe I need to have my vision checked. Maybe I'm misunderstanding something. So there are reasons that people generate for going along with the group in this process, even though privately they believe that their response is the correct one. Well, folks, because of this type of conformity, we see the importance of the ballot booth where you can go and vote privately on your own. Who knows what elections would turn out to be if we had to vote in public and we felt enormous pressure to yield one way or the other. So one of the ways that we increase or enhance independent judgment is letting people make private judgments so they can make judgments on their own. One of the things that works, when you start to do it in a public situation, you have the power of the group to force decisions in certain ways because people very often will be embarrassed to do something independently. Clearly, fundraisers know this when they go out and they get people together and they try to get them to make pledges. You have a lot of people stand up and make big pledges, and it gets around to somebody else, and people sort of wither, and they're embarrassed to give a small pledge. The power of the group to push yielding in a certain direction, done quite specifically. Okay, so that's one of the things that happens. What is it that accounts for the tendency to conform? Group size, clearly an important factor. Too small a group, you can be independent. A group of two, it's very independent. It's just you against the other person. He said, she said. Who's ever right? Very easy to be independent against one person. Two people is a little bit more difficult if you have to go against two people. Groups of four, even more so. And it builds up to about 9 or 10. And then as it starts to get larger, there's a drop again. There's not as much conformity as the group starts to build. In part because of the same reasons that went on in terms of social loafing. You don't feel quite as connected to the group. And so it's easier to be more independent in a large group than it is a smaller group. The group process and power, much more so in the smaller group. Unanimity of opinion. If everybody in the group says one thing, it's really hard to go against the rest of the group. If there's even one partner in crime out there to help you, then you can begin to think of opposing. And this is going to be, again, something important to carry forward when we talk about group decision making and getting really good decisions. This unanimity of opinion. And the need to be courageous in groups and be brave when everybody's sort of nodding and assenting and going ahead with what one individual is saying and thrusting your hand up and saying, but what about? Have you considered? So that another opinion gets tossed in. Because the tendency, I think, in groups is you sit there and you're thinking about something which sort of goes against the main thrust of the conversation that's going on. People are barreling towards a decision in one way, and you're thinking about all these contingencies why that might be not such a good decision, and nobody else is voicing it. And here we have the typical situation for conformity. Something wrong with me that I'm the only one thinking about these and nobody else is? And the tendency, I think, is for people to keep their mouths shut and not speak up when those things should be voiced and should be voiced strongly, because the decision will be so much worse unless you consider those issues. But it means that you have to put in the effort to defend the things that you're talking about. And it means that you may have to withstand some group disapproval because the group wants to move to quick resolution. And you're the one who's holding them back. And you're the one who's throwing sand into the gears and slowing a process down where everybody wants to move to a quick decision. But there have been some poor decisions made in the course of time. We will talk about later on a process called groupthink, and we will study some of those poor decisions. Group status and attractiveness. Yet another issue. The higher the status of the group, the more attractive the group, the more people are going to conform to the group. That's a group you really want to be a member of, you're going to go along with it. Fraternities, again, prime example of yielding to the group, because those groups are so attractive to the individual and are seen as having status. And so people go along and conform with that. The lower the status, the less attractive the group is to you. It's not going to be so important to conform, to the extent that you can say to yourself, I really don't care about what the group thinks about me. Then you can be independent. So it depends how much you're going to want that group approval in terms of conformity. Another issue is something that people don't think about very much in groups. It's called support for nonconformity. If the group has built into it some norm that encourages independent thinking, you're going to get independent thinking in a group. There are not too many groups that build this in organizations, but the role would be something of a devil's advocate. Somebody whose role it is to think of reasons why a solution won't work, why a plan is not the best way to go, the one that's being offered on the table, because people haven't thought of various things. Take an example. Tobacco companies are paying out enormous amounts of money right now, huge amounts of money. Would their decisions have been better if they'd done some things along the route where they wouldn't have had to pay out so much money? I mean, one of the things that has gotten them off the hook, and they resisted it enormously, was simply label the warning on it. That's been a cushion for them. That came on out of regulation. They didn't want that to begin with. So if we can look at, companies have made bad decisions. And I will bet somewhere around those tables there were people who had the information, and it was not listened to and maybe not even offered. And ultimately there was conformity to the group. So if you can institutionalize this notion of the devil's advocate, somebody whose role it is in the organization to look at reasons why something won't work, that's rewarding independent thinking in the organization. Some organizations have the ombudsman in, somebody you can go to in the organization to report things that you think are not so kosher and not working so well in the organization. So there's support built in there for nonconformity. If people are rewarded for independent thinking, they'll think independently. But most of the situations are situations where we tend to think the reward is for going along with everybody else and not independent thinking. And finally, the role of competence. I'm talking about individual competence, the extent to which you feel you have experience, knowledge, and skill in an area. And the more you feel that you have knowledge, skill, and competence in an area, the more comfortable you are going against the group. You're now defining yourself as an expert compared to all of those people. Everybody's sitting around the table. If you felt like, yeah, you'd been in situations where you judged lines. I don't know what your work was, but you had to make line judgments before. You were the line judgment expert. In this position, you would not feel so uncomfortable yielding or being independent in judgment. So that's yet another thing to take into consideration in terms of getting independent judgment in groups. So sometimes we want independent judgment. What do? Try to, if there's a position that you have that's going to go against what a lot of other people you think are going to say in the group, get a partner. Share your ideas with a partner and go in there knowing that two of you are going to agree to this position. Sometimes the minority voice prevails. Not very often, but sometimes it does. What does it take for a minority voice to prevail in an organization? Tenacity and persistence. You need to just keep hammering at it and hammering at it and hammering at it and coming back to your position. You need to believe in your position. You need to believe it's the right position. And then be willing to stick up for it and put in effort and then start to build coalitions. And yes, sometimes the minority voice does prevail and things do turn around in organizations. It takes a long time. It's difficult. Tenacity and persistence. But it has worked in organizations. They have changed. They've become more socially responsible over a lot of areas. And sometimes it's due to the persistent voice, somebody in there. I have one example I want to toss out to you in terms of the persistent independent voice. This goes back many, many years, although the drug is in the news again. It's a drug called thalidomide. I don't know if anybody's familiar with it, but it has properties of reducing nausea in people. That's very important, particularly when you're treating people with certain drugs for cancer and things like that. But it got its start in use with women who were pregnant and combating morning sickness. It became quite popular in Europe, I'm going to say in the 60s. I believe it was late 60s, I think about was the time, maybe mid 60s. It never was really okayed in the US by the FDA. And here you had the persistence of a woman in a laboratory, I believe up in Bar Harbor, where she was looking at the effect of this drug on successive generations of mice. She was administering it to pregnant mice, rats, and looking at the effect on offsprings. And she observed in this case that there were deformed offsprings. Well, in fact, the effect of thalidomide on women who took it in Europe was large numbers of children being born with deformities, particularly in the limbs. It seemed to have an effect on the arms and legs, and severe deformities. Never really happened in the US, except for some women who got the drug from abroad. And here you had the persistence of a woman in doing her research and accumulating her information. I mean, there was a real pressure from drug companies to get this approved for this use, and never got approved. And we avoided some of the catastrophe that went on in Great Britain and other countries in Europe. The voice of the minority being heard, sticking to it, tenacity and persistence, and not letting go until you were sure you had all the things covered. So an example of it paying off. Okay, we're hearing about it again because the idea is, yes, it can be used safely, but you don't use it with women who are in childbearing years. That's the problem. Okay. Leaders need to know when to design teams so they get conformity and when to get them for independence. What can we say about getting teams that are high performance? Because chances are, when you get your jobs, you're going to be working on a team. Teams have become extremely pervasive in industry today. General Electric, AT&T, Apple Computer, Hewlett-Packard, Johnson & Johnson, Saturn, we can go on in the companies that use teams and use teams at all different levels. Is there a payoff for teams? Do they in fact work better? And the answer is yes, when? When you meet certain conditions. Because there are times when you can get some of the problems, the process losses that we talked about happening with teams as well. So what is it that you have to do in terms of building teams? Well, first let's start with staffing a team. You need to have the right members on the team, which means that you need to staff them with regard to skill level and experience and skills and knowledge. The idea of a team is it should draw across some diversity. You bring people in with different skills to the team so they can contribute in different areas. In terms of performance level, if you have people who are at low abilities, now we're talking at ability kinds of things, and you put them all together on a team, you've constructed a disastrous team. That team just isn't going to function. Of course, the best functioning teams are those who are all of high ability levels, but you're going to have to mix ability levels across teams. One of the things you want to make sure is you don't put everybody with low ability on one team. Bring in a couple of high, disperse those people in groups. Okay, and you may be able to jack up their ability level by mixing them up with higher ability people. If it's really crucial that you get something out really fast, crisis situation, then get a high ability team. Put them all together. That's going to work the best. So that on staffing and ability levels. You don't place somebody on the team who is resistant to being a team member. Some people don't want this group stuff. It's hard work. It's hard work, particularly in terms of the communication business and coordination business and adherence to the norms. The situation. Clarify goals so the team knows what it's doing, knows what the product is, knows when it has to get out. And then train the team and train the team and train the team. Put resources into the team, and they're going to have to go through team training. I'm not just talking about training for skills, I'm talking about team training, learning how to coordinate with each other and get information to each other in a timely way, and learning to trust each other. That's tough. You know you can trust yourself. Can you rely on somebody else to get it out? Well, in a team situation, you have to rely on somebody else. And the team part of it comes about in the group influence. But you also need to reward the team. If you want the team to perform as a team, reward them as a team. Tie individual rewards to team performance. Reward the team. But don't overlook individual contributions, because you want those real high performers and stars on the team to understand that you value what they're doing, but you don't want them to also become prima donnas on the team. You've got to balance the star on the team characteristic against the prima donna characteristic. That person has to remain a member of the team and know that they have to contribute and help out on the team. The group influence. Here is one of the difficulties. Groups can certainly reward each other in terms of good performance, but can they discipline each other? Can you use the group that way? And the answer is yes, you can. Okay, and that's where you really get the value out of the group, is using the group to somehow jack up effort levels, to let other members know when they're not performing up to par, saying we were counting on you and you got to get your performance up to par. But you've got to also give them latitude, authority, and responsibility to have some way of dealing with this within the group as well. So yes, groups do perform well. They outperform individuals when certain situations are met. When you're using group influence appropriately, when you're giving the team the resources that it needs to do the job, and when you've got the right members on the team. So, we've started out today with examining how the group influences individual performance, its social facilitation, its social loafing. We've looked at conformity, and we have looked at high-performance teams. Next time, we look at communication within the group, with a particular look at how all of this new technology and telecommunications affects communication in the organization. Next time.